Okay, let's give it 30 more seconds and then we'll kick off. Welcome everyone that just joined. Okay, we have a packed agenda today, so we'll just start. Welcome everyone. Good to see you here, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on data privacy, which is considered to be an essential part of consumer protection for off-grid solar companies. So again, good to see you all here today. A little housekeeping, as you noticed, the session will be recorded and shared with you all afterwards, together with the slides. Then please feel free to share any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll try to answer them all. Yeah, so for today's agenda, we'll officially launch the newest briefing note, as I said, that is on data privacy. Then Isabel Bars, who's with us today, will share everything about the risks of data privacy for both consumers and companies, and as well share the mitigations to these risks that companies can adopt. During the session, we will hear as well from Sun Culture and Solaris Off-Grid and get some inspiring insights of the measures they've taken to improve data privacy practices. And I think without further ado, I will hand over to Rebecca Rhodes, who will take it over from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Puck, and thank you to all who can join us today. So personal data privacy is one of the 6 principles of the GOGLA Consumer Protection Code, and it entails ensuring adherence to good data practices and local laws in country of operations, limiting the collection and use of data to what is deemed essential and of legitimate interest for your business, and making sure that consumers' information is protected and secure at all times. But this can be particularly challenging for off-grid solar companies, not least because of, as I've learned over the last 6 months whilst carrying out this project, data privacy, it's a bit of a minefield, and it's one that's only getting more and more complex as the world becomes more digital. And for off-grid solar and pay-go businesses in particular, the data and digitalization opportunities is bringing kind of new areas of innovation and new benefits for consumers and companies alike. But if we compound this with literacy, especially digital literacy issues, wide networks of third-party service providers and agents, and increasing threats in general, we can see how this could be a bit of a challenging area for companies to safeguard for their consumers. Next slide, please, Book. And so over the last few months, GOGLA with Isabel, we've been working on this new guidance for companies, which forms part of the Consumer Protection Toolkit, for which we're developing a suite of resources and guides for companies. And so we've consulted across the industry to find, good practices and source the kind of lessons from what companies are already doing. And we've adapted the insights and learnings from the MFI and digital finance sectors too. So this new report will be available on our website after the webinar today. And we'll send the link around with the recording afterwards as well. So without more from me, I will hand over now to Isabel, who has brought kind of experience from the SMART campaign and MFI sector in particular to really help us put this guidance together to understand the risks and share some of the good practices for companies across the sector as well. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Puck and Rebecca. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to share the highlights of the GOGLA data privacy study. As Rebecca said, data privacy is a minefield. I think it's a very accurate image, even though a little bit scary. But there are definitely some things that companies can do. So we're excited to share what we've learned. So as part of the research for the brief, we did a few things. We did a literature review on the data privacy landscape, and in particular also the off-grid solar models. And we also conducted several key informant interviews with off-grid solar companies and with a few data privacy experts in order to learn more about the specific data privacy risks that are involved in the off-grid solar business models. Next slide, Puck, please. So the research that we did enabled us to develop a taxonomy for data privacy for off-grid solar companies. We won't have time to go over the details of the slide today, but you will get it afterwards and also have more details in the actual report. The aim is really to continue to refine the taxonomy over time with more examples from the experiences of GOGLA members. Data privacy in a nutshell is about protecting the privacy of individual client data. Consumers have a right that their data be kept confidential and accurate, and data privacy, as reflected in the current standards and indicators that GOGLA has developed, refers to the notion that companies will only use the client data for legitimate purposes and with client consent. It also refers to the fact that companies will maintain their systems secure so that they can keep personal consumer data from being accessed without authorization. So what do we mean by personal data? Personal data is any data that can be linked back to the individual consumer. Off-grid solar companies process a wide range of consumer data. Few examples are basic KYC or know your customer data, such as name or ID. There's also income-related data in the case of financing of the solar device, such as PAYGO. So that could be housing type, family size, education, literacy levels, a wide range of data points. Financial data as well. PAYGO companies generate a large amount of financial data, as every payment, SMS, or call creates a data point. And then there is also the usage data that is linked to the actual usage of the device through Internet of Things or IoT technology that is embedded in the solar device and that enables to capture the transactional data about data usage in the case of PAYGO as well. So all of that data, to the extent that it can be traced back to the individual consumers, is considered personal data and is protected under the data privacy laws. The main risks fall under four categories: those that are linked to employee behavior, whether it's intentional or not; those that are linked to processes, whether it's that the company has a lack of well-defined processes or that the processes are there, but there's a gap in the implementation of these processes. There's also risks linked to system failure or external risks. In the bucket of external risks, we just want to call out also risks that are linked to the data ecosystem at large. A weak data ecosystem, for example, lack of adequate regulation or lack of cybersecurity rules or ecosystem as well, or weak connectivity or issues that result in frequent failures, for example, can also compromise data privacy. So there's this notion that data security is also very, very key and very embedded in the concept of data privacy. Researching the impact of poor data privacy across the digital financial services landscape, which is also relevant for off-grid solar. CGAP, for example, determined that in the last few years, from 2016 to 2020, the data vulnerabilities rose significantly and reported that the increase in the records exposed more than double the increase of the data that was created. This speaks to the trend that Rebecca was speaking about earlier in this presentation, that the risks are really continuing to rise exponentially. A few things to call out, given the prevalence of the PAYGO model in the off-grid solar sector and the dependence on mobile payments and on IoT or Internet of Things technology to remotely control and monitor the devices. And also given the reliance on agent networks, these are areas that should be given special attention when addressing data privacy issues in the off-grid solar sector. Next slide, please. So we see that the lack of data privacy affects both the companies and their customers. The risk from processing personal data can take many forms and result in varying degrees of harm, including physical, material, or non-material harm, depending on the information that is accessed. For example, a breach of KYC type data, so contact or ID information, can lead to identity theft or harassment. If you combine that with financial data, such as account information, it can also lead to financial losses. Another example is a breach of customer geolocalization and information about the solar products that they have accessed or they are using can also put the customer at a higher risk of theft of the actual solar device. From a company's perspective, all of this can lead to financial loss or reputational damage and also ultimately reduced impact. Next slide. Here, this is just to illustrate that data privacy is potentially at risk along the entire data life cycle. So anytime data travels or is exchanged between two parties. So let's consider a few examples. At the time of capture, for example, there's a risk that if the systems that are used to collect the information are not secure, that the data is going to be vulnerable to breaches from hackers who can get into the company system. Here, it's important to note also that the data that is captured offline, so to speak, or through in-person interviews are not exempt from risk. And the risk can happen in a different way. But for example, if the data is captured in a way that does not respect confidentiality. So for example, if a company representative asks a consumer to provide personal data in a crowded space where other people can overhear the conversation, that can also put the data at risk. Then during transport, data can be at risk if the digital channels are not secured or if documentation containing personal data is lost or stolen. Data can be stored for longer than it's really needed and forgotten, which increases the vulnerabilities to attacks. Vulnerabilities also exist when the data is accessed by people who do not have a business need for it. So this can happen if the PAYGO management system, for example, does not have differentiated user access levels, and if employees can have access to data that is not relevant for the functions that they need to perform. So for example, if sales personnel have access to repayment data, or if agents have access to data also that they don't need. Data privacy is also at risk when data is used in a way that is not authorized by the consumer. So for example, when it's used more for the benefit of the company, for cross-selling or for marketing. And last but not least, clients should know who has access to their personal data and should have a say in the matter. We'll talk more about this later in the presentation, but or at least they should be informed when this data is shared because it's legally mandated. So for example, when sharing with a credit bureau. Data sharing is especially detrimental to client when it is done to benefit the company without clear benefits for the client. For example, when the data is sold when the personal data is sold to third parties, but there's not a clear benefit. So analyzing the data lifecycle, who's involved into transaction, what systems are used, and also thinking preemptively of the vulnerabilities that are linked to data processing, whether it's done digitally or in person. All of this is key to developing the appropriate mitigation strategies, such as policies, trainings, or system security. A last point to close this part on risk is to say that while all off-grid solar companies face vulnerability and their customers face vulnerabilities when it comes to data privacy, they're not affected to the same extent and in the same way. And we'll hear from two companies later also today. Data vulnerabilities will be exacerbated, for example, by the volume and the type of data that is processed, such as sensitive or financial data, which make it more valuable to potential hackers. It will also be exacerbated by the complexity of the company's business models and the number of touch points where the data changes hands. And finally, also by the number of partner relationships that the company needs to vet and manage, and the reliance on these partners, such as the reliance on agents for interacting with the customers. So after this quick overview of the risk landscape, I will pass it back to you, Puck.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So yeah, today we are joined by John Sanders and Tom Franke. So welcome very much, both from Sun Culture. And we will hear a bit more on how they are leveraging data across their operations, while at the same time taking steps to ensure that this is done in a responsible way. A bit more on Sun Culture. This is a Pego solar water pumps, a company that sells Pego solar water pumps and drip irrigation solutions to smallholder farmers in Kenya. And the company is innovating around how customer and product usage data can best be used to improve services and satisfaction rates for the company. And there have already been tangible benefits for consumers. And we wanted to show this as a good example of how we as a sector can protect data while we are still innovating ourselves as well. So John and Tom, welcome. Good to have you today. Could you tell us a bit more about the process of leveraging this consumer data to bring extra benefits to the consumers, and how you are building in data privacy mechanisms into this approach?
Yeah, thank you, Puck. And can you hear me okay? Just want to confirm. Yes? Okay, yeah. Perfect. Well, thanks for having us again. I really appreciate it. I think a couple of things, I'll start off just kind of at a high level and let Tom kind of come in with further detail. But you know, at our operation, you know, obviously we're leveraging you know, data to help us extend credit to customers. And what we do is we use multiple touch points with a customer to ensure that they understand the product, the benefits, troubleshooting, payment mechanisms, terms, contract escalation processes, so on and so forth. And we do this by, again, leveraging data and software to help us both do that and also extract further insights from the customer to help understand things such as repayment patterns and behaviors and usage information, so on and so forth. It was imperative for us to start really focusing on taking a deep dive on the BI side of things, on the Pego end first, as opposed to focusing so much on the sales side of it. And we're definitely see some of that kind of play off. At a high level, what we do is we have some internal kind of data collection mechanisms. So we have an internal credit scoring algorithm that we're able to run that's kind of based off of historical repayment and usage and profile information. And then we also leverage external kind of platforms such as the CRB or a platform such as Smile Identity to help us really kind of build out a robust profile of that customer and understanding. I think it's important to note from like a consumer protection standpoint, you know, we do include all of this in our contract that the customer signs and is explained at the time of installation, and then also is explained again through a relationship manager and a follow-up conversation. This includes things such as discussing that, you know, a negative performance on the Pego side will result in a CRB listing, We could turn off the asset remotely. They might be handed over to a collections agency, so on and so forth. So that's all explained multiple times for the customer through those different touch points that I noted above. We're able to do this just kind of given we have a very kind of, I think, unique tech stack. In that, we're able to really leverage a modular application network centered around a single source of truth. We were able to build our own proprietary account management tool along with device management platform. This really gives us like a lot of flexibility and agility in terms of how we manage our operations. I think it not only gives us full control over our application network and our data, but it also gives us control over who can really see and use it. And so we noted before, kind of being able to silo different pieces of data is really important as it relates to consumer protection. Again, this gives us an incredible amount of agility for us to be able to view, analyze, and extract information and insights from the data that we have coming in. And then furthermore, it also kind of gives us a more ability, given that that we're full owners of all of this information, to be able to really ensure that it's secure and able to also adapt as a lot of consumer protection laws in places such as Kenya are changing or are being developed. As I noted earlier, we developed an internal credit scoring algorithm. This is all been done, kind of based on some work that we did with CGAP and the folks at the Frankfurt School of Management. I was hoping Dan Waldron would be on the call. He was instrumental in helping us kind of develop this credit scoring mechanism along with the folks at Frankfurt School over the last couple of years. We're in a place now where we've gone through and done the recalibration and starting, tying it to customer profiles as well as tying it to usage information, which is pretty exciting. By using all this information, again, we're able to identify challenges, opportunities, trends, and really measure the effectiveness of some of the efforts that we might be running to improve portfolio performance in real time. We're working to further automate some of the stuff, alerts, messages, internal training, so on and so forth, over time. And again, Tom will kind of talk towards kind of what we're doing in the future. But again, this is all centered around a really strong kind of data platform. And then furthermore, I want to note that, we're also building in further capabilities to extend how we're able to leverage data for our customer side. So this is things such as training, proper farm training, soil analysis, all things that we can kind of add in to really kind of help build a robust platform, for our customers. And then kind of backing up, as I noted earlier, we have a very modular application network. And so we're able to extend either parts or the whole bit of this to our partners. And so, we work with a big partnership with Bbox in Togo. They're using, one application out of the whole application network for them versus, another partner in Ethiopia or Uganda, kind of similar, real similar setup. I think the thing that, again, robust, kind of just routing this off from my comments is that, on our end, it really takes a continuous kind of effort to ensure that we're living up to the GOGLA consumer protection suggestions. And I think that, what we've done is we've done continuous engagements, audits, follow-ups, both with GOGLA consultants and local law firms to ensure that, we're not only compliant, but we're also trying to keep ourselves a bit ahead of the curve as it relates to consumer protection for our customers, given that, how we're using data is so important for our underlying business. I'll pause there and maybe hand it over to Tom to maybe speak a little bit further on our efforts now and moving forward.
Yeah, thanks, John. Such an exciting space. I think we maybe, John, to quickly add on to the usability side. So through our IoT platform, we have the unique capabilities to really understand on a continuous basis the customer satisfaction our customers have with our products. We are building out sort of flagging mechanisms to identify customers who are using our products less than we wanted to, and sort of tailor our approach in terms of outreach for customer satisfaction around that, which is something we're looking at in 2022, as well as layering some information services that are aimed at helping our customers to get the best out of their products, such as training data, but also building out a platform for visibility of our customers into the IoT data set. And Park, as you said, it's a delicate balance between understanding what you can do with data as well as making sure that the data is kept secure. So on the dry side of data, within Sun Culture, we take data security very, very, it's very important to us. On the application side, we have a cloud-first strategy. for both data processing as well as hosting, which means that we are able to host and process data according to the best security standards in the market. And as John mentioned, one benefit of having a flexible application network is not only the modularity, but also our ability to store data in separate verticals without it being directly linked to customer identifiable information, and makes us less vulnerable to a big data breach in case that would happen. Furthermore, all of our applications, both on the application side as well as on the database side, we have built-in advanced user management and are very good at mapping the responsibilities of the different roles within the organization back to the data that they're able to view and act upon, as well as sort of rolling that out cross market as well. That said, we're still continuously improving. And I think how we improve is, one, to understand the perception of our customers on the rights that they have in light of their data. So we do continuous customer protection audits through our outgoing call center. And a few of the questions that are mostly centered around product satisfaction are also aimed at the sort of assessment, how well customers know our terms and conditions and their right when it comes to data. On the other side, to understand that we need to keep learning is we have a very strong partnership with the experts in the fields when it comes to compliance for country-specific data legislation. And that really helped us to be on the forefront of understanding what is required from us, either as a data processor or as a data storing entity. So like it's a process of continuously innovating, keeping focus on the good things, but making sure we do we have our vulnerabilities sorted out as well. Thanks for.
Thank you very much, Tom and John. Very interesting to hear, and yeah, great. Thank you very much for sharing. Yeah, with that, we'd also like to hear a bit more from the audience. So we have a small poll question to hear from you as well. So we would like to hear, what do you see as the biggest priority when it comes to data privacy? And please, you can check the top 3 of your priorities. I will launch it now. Hope you can see it. Yeah, so please see if it's about improving client understanding, as was mentioned before as well, and the terms of services, or keeping up with data privacy regulations, I think mentioned as well, or more about building data privacy into the product design, or improving the accountability of the agents, improving the accountability of partners, or improving the security that is linked to the processing of personal data. Or the last one is improving understanding of customer preferences about data privacy. So please pick 3 that you think are the biggest priority for your company or for yourself. Let's see some answers coming in. Give it a few more seconds for the last people to respond. Okay. Oh, the last one. Okay. I'll share the results now. Oh, so there's a big winner, I would say. So the main priority for most of you is to improve client understanding of contracts and terms of services, with a high majority of 76%. Then we also see a big priority is to improve security that is linked to the processing of personal data. And then next to that would come building data privacy into the product design, which is also really interesting. Okay, thank you very much for sharing. Maybe Isabel, you could share with us a bit on whether this resonates with you or this is something you've heard as well during the consultations you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will talk about this as we go through the recommendations. One of the recommendations is definitely to improve the understanding of clients for the terms of service and the contract. And that definitely resonated through all of the companies, almost all of the companies that were interviewed as part of the research for this brief. So it definitely resonates. Interesting. So now let's get into the recommendations. So the brief, the GOGLA data privacy brief, outlines 8 main recommendations for off-grid solar companies. We recommend that off-grid solar companies first start with understanding the specific vulnerabilities that are linked to their specific business models. I highlight that the importance of that, or the distinctions of the vulnerabilities a little bit earlier, and then also take stock of their consumer data via a data register. So first, what are the biggest vulnerabilities? The type of business model, whether a company is a distributor versus a vertically integrated company versus a software company, whether the company is also operating on cash sales versus a pay-go financing model. All of this influences both the type of consumer data that is collected and also the way in which the company interacts with the data. So the first step we're recommending is that companies should reflect on what data is exchanged, when and with whom, how many parties are involved, is it digitized or not, how is it currently protected, so what are the current systems, processes that you have in place. And as I said before, the areas that merit special attention include any time there are consumer-facing activities, such as sales and customer service. Those are points in time in the relationship with the customer where data is particularly at risk. Another area also that we're calling out is management of the payment side of things, the financial side of things, whether it's digital credit or payments, and the partnerships with the mobile money providers. To the extent possible, we recommend to, for example, work with mobile money providers that are certified by GSMA. That's already an indication that they are themselves abiding to good consumer protection practices. Another area is business-to-business partnerships that involve end-user consumer data, for example, for pay-go software services, and any other part of the business that are outsourced to agents or third-party providers. A few examples are companies that manage agent networks. They should be mindful of the incentives for agents and what is needed for them to be adequately equipped to uphold good data privacy practices. I won't get into too much detail. GOGLA is currently undergoing a study on agents, and we'll have more to say in the near future. Another example is manufacturing companies. They should integrate data privacy consideration in the product design itself, especially as related to Internet of Things protocols. And for that, Consumer International has come out with great recommendations. Pay-go software providers, or in general, companies that are not working directly with the end consumer, can encourage their own clients to embrace good practices to protect the end consumer data. And we'll hear more about that a little bit later. Next slide. So we recommend taking stock. We also recommend that you take stock of your data to the creation of a data registry. This is an example of the data registry. Data registry identifies a few key points. One, each type of data that is collected and used, where it comes from, and the business purpose for processing the data. So for type of data, could be KYC related, financial, transactional, or linked to usage. The source of data, some typical sources of data include data from the consumers themselves, or data from the data collector through observation with the customer, or data that comes from a credit bureau. So those are some examples. For use of data, some reasons for processing data can include linked to legal obligations such as KYC, or for checking credit worthiness with the data from the credit registry or the credit bureau, or data that is collected to simply offer and service the off-grid solar product, or financing also the product through PAYGO. The other 6 recommendations for off-grid solar companies relate to, on one hand, empowering the off-grid solar consumers, and on the other hand, increasing the responsibility of the companies themselves. So let's first look at the first 3 on the consumer side. So good practice for off-grid solar companies, for their agents and their partners, is to ensure that the consumers know what personal data is collected and generated and how the company processes it. Consumers are equipped to make an informed decision. Ideally, they clearly understand what they're getting in exchange for consenting to sharing their personal data. They have choices. They can choose to share more data in exchange for additional services, but they're not forced to share more data than the minimum required to access the service. And last, consumers also know their rights and how to exercise them. So how can off-grid solar companies achieve these outcomes? So the first recommendation relates to improving contracts. So this goes back to one of the key areas of interest through the poll. Improving the contracts so that the data privacy clauses are more meaningful. This also cuts across transparency good practices, such as those that are highlighted in a separate brief from GOGLA that is focused on transparency issues. There is increasing evidence that shows that consumers greatly value privacy and that they're actually willing to pay more for higher levels of privacy. PAYGO contracts can be long, complex documents. We've heard as long as 8 to 10 pages. Companies are advised to steer clear of vague and generic clauses and be specific about how the data will be used and who will have access to it. They're also encouraged to audit contracts and terms of service, or really any document that is shared with the consumer, for content completeness, clarity, and readability. In terms of readability, there are some interesting tools that are available to audit the readability of written documents that would be applicable to contracts. Auditing the readability of a document really is about gauging whether the contract is understandable. One of these tools is the Gunning Fog Index. You may have heard of it. It's one of the most reliable and simplest tool to apply, and it could be used by companies to evaluate the readability of their policies. What it's about is really a simple formula that entails looking at the number of words per sentence and the complexity of the sentences as proxied, I believe, by the number of syllables that are in each word and number of words, yeah. And it generates a readability scores and estimates the level of education that is required to understand the text. So the higher the index, the higher the level of education that is typically required to understand the written material. This could be especially helpful in contexts where the consumers have low level of literacy, as a way for companies to do a quick check. In addition to also what's in the contracts, to improving what's in the contracts, companies can also improve the way in which they communicate with consumers. So here, a key issue, as I was saying, that has been flagged by many companies during our interviews was the dependence on agents to convey information in the contracts, and the difficulty in monitoring and ensuring that the agents themselves abide to company policies and that they don't take shortcuts. Companies are advised to standardize the processes used by agents to communicate with consumers so that they can provide more consistencies around what is communicated and how it's communicated. So this can, for example, take the form of scripts for agents to communicate terms and conditions, or having a process that includes a standard welcome call that is managed by a centralized customer service team. Another key recommendation is to improve mechanism for consent. Consent is really tricky. It's widely recognized that consent is very, very broken, to say the least. CGAP has written extensively on the topic, and there are some excellent resources that are available. So do we throw consent out the window? Do we try to fix it? Is it even worth fixing? There is a really strong desire from off-grid solar companies to improve consent, and that came out again overwhelmingly in our consultations. Whether we like consent or not, the notion of consent is currently really underpinning a lot of data privacy practices. So our stance is that we should try to do it better, that is in a way that is more meaningful, and use it as an opportunity to educate and empower consumers. It's not to say that consent in and of itself is enough and that it should absolve companies from responsibility. For example, consumers should not be asked to consent to options that do not benefit them. So what does meaningful consent look like? First, it implies that there is choice. There cannot be meaningful consent without choice. The GSMA Code of Conduct also reiterates these points. Instead of asking consumers for blanket consent, as it's often the case, providers, companies should be more discerning and give consumers a choice. So companies can put this in practice by, for example, discerning what data is mandatory for consumers to share in order to have access to the service. For example, what's required to track the PAYGO service, or what's required to report to a credit bureau, versus data that is not mandatory, even if it could benefit the consumer if shared. Optional data, for example, may help the company better understand the needs of the consumer and offer targeted services, or help the company improve services or payment options. And we've heard a bit on that from John earlier. Off-grid solar companies are encouraged to be transparent about what data is mandatory, what is not, and to also help understand, help the consumers understand the trade-offs between the various options. Another key point for meaningful consent is that it should be is that consumers should be protected by default, and that consent should be an active versus a passive choice. This refers to the default bias. So there is, again, a lot of evidence to the default bias. That what is the default bias? It refers to the fact that people will tend to accept the default options that are presented to them. So with that information in mind, it's really critical that the default choices that are presented to consumers are set to the maximum level of data privacy. Ideally, marketing communication should be an opt-in versus an opt-out as practically feasible, and companies should allow clients to make differentiated decisions on non-essential versus essential communication. So, for example, receiving marketing messages versus transactional messages. This can also help companies ensure that clients keep receiving key communication from them, even if the clients choose not to receive marketing communication. The last key recommendation on the consumer side is to empower and enable consumers to exercise their data rights. According to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the European data protection law that now has become a reference for much of the rest of the world, consumers have a long list of rights, including the right of access to their data, the right to rectification, the right to erasure, also known as the right to be forgotten, the right to restriction of processing, the right to be notified, the right to data portability, right to object, and right not to be subject to automated individual decision-making, including profiling. But having all these rights is really not useful if consumers don't know their rights and or don't know how to exercise them, which is most likely the situation. Exercising data-related rights is too often overly complex and impractical. As illustrated in a recent research by CFI in Rwanda, knowing your rights is not enough. And that research, a third of clients that were surveyed indicated that they would likely not contact their lenders if they knew that the lender was using incorrect data about them because of the difficulty of getting through the busy hotlines. So this is an area where more research on off-grid solar consumer perceptions, preferences, and barriers would be very valuable. Off-grid solar companies should explain to consumers what their data rights are and provide channels for them to exercise them. A few practical steps in that area that companies can implement and that we have seen are, for example, to guide consumers in a step-by-step process, either through their online platform or through call centers, so that consumers also have access to a channel, an offline channel, so that this gives the ability to consumers to submit a request to access or rectify or delete their data if needed. Next slide. So on the company side, we see, as we've seen, consumers can be better empowered and have more agency, but this doesn't replace the company's responsibility. So good practices for responsible data management also entails that companies act as a fiduciary for consumer data and act within consumers' best interest. This approach of the company acting as a fiduciary has been described at length by CGAP as a way to build consumer trust in their providers. So how to be a good fiduciary? We have a few recommendations. First, we recommend that off-grid solar companies minimize the data footprint of their consumers. Off-grid solar companies can aim to process only data that is needed to offer the service and only data where there is a legitimate purpose or that benefits the consumer. The data register that was mentioned earlier can help companies to confirm that there is a legitimate purpose for the use of data. For off-grid solar companies, this may include processing data, for example, to make decisions about the product financing or to report to the credit bureau, or to process payments, or to control access to the device in case of non-payment or service, or to make sure the service is working properly, and to monitor the function of the off-grid solar product to provide predictive servicing or to fulfill warranty terms. So as companies become more digitalized and data-driven, and this was also mentioned before, there can be a tension between the concept of legitimate purpose and the notion of processing only data that is currently needed, and in that limits the potential exploration of what could be done with more data. So as long as it benefits customers, as long as there is an intention to benefit customers and that the consumers are aware that this extra data is collected, then that would be a legitimate purpose. Another way to minimize the personal data footprint is also to de-identify personal data, so making it de facto no longer personal. Data that is used for purely analytical or business intelligence purposes should be depersonalized. There are some issues in depersonalizing the data. There are various ways in which data can be de-identified. I won't go into the details, but just to name a few: anonymization, pseudonymization, aggregation, tokenization, which really refers to substituting a number for a client data element so that it can be identified. Some of the issues around depersonalizing the consumer data are that some of the depersonalized data can be repersonalized through data triangulation that is made possible by big data. So this is something to keep in mind. It's not foolproof, or there are some methods that are more effective than others. Lastly, the final two recommendations that we have for companies refer to: one, implementing good practices through effective training for the staff and agents, That's a topic, as I mentioned, that is going to be covered in more detail in an other upcoming study by GOGLA that will be focused on agents. And second, strengthening of data security protocols. So last slide is a summary of the 8 high-level recommendations for off-grid solar companies to improve their data privacy. With that, thank you for your attention, and I pass the mic back to you, Puck.
Thank you very much, Isabel. There's so much to share. Unfortunately, we only have a limited time today, but there's more to read in the briefing notes. So thank you very much, Isabel, for today. Yeah, next up, we will hear from Benjamin David, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Solaris Off-Grid. Solaris is supporting companies in over 20 countries, delivering off-grid solar products, among other essential services, to last mile customers, and they mainly do this through their PayGoP software and product development services. And while it is outside of the purview of their own contractual obligations, we've learned that Solaris are actually working to improve data privacy for end users by working with their business-to-business clients and helping them to adopt good data security practices. So Benjamin, we're all very curious to hear. So could you share with us a little bit more about, well, maybe first the data privacy challenges that you see, and how you are helping your distribution partners to adopt these practices? If you would.
Sure. Thank you very much for that. Yes, so maybe to start with the challenge here, I think it's been talked about at length already, but there is obviously like a first challenge of controlling the processes of the distributors and having distributors with various processes on which we don't really have a direct control over. However, what we try to do is to design the software and our services in a way that pushes the distributor to adopt best practices. Another challenge that we see is the use of old technology, which sometimes makes security a little bit difficult. And so sort of keeping those challenges in mind, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we actually try to do to make sure that the data of the clients of our distributors is protected. And starting, I guess, with the most basic, which is what I was just talking about, the security. We make sure that from the start, like the software itself, the way it's hosted, we adopt like security best practices. That comes from other industries like the banking industries that have high standards in terms of IT security. And that's something that's very important, I think, is something that all the SaaS software providers should really be doing, in particular when you're handling a sensitive data like we are doing. And in top of that, like more technical aspect of security, another aspect of the security is making sure that in case of a human error, the data that might be accessed is really limited to what is necessary for the person using the system. And we do that through the granular permission controls that we implemented in our software. So each distributor can really make sure that each of their agents not only has access only to the data that matters to them. So if they're a sales agent, they can only access the sales data, but also has access to the data only that's really relevant to their particular location. So the distributor can define for each agent like a small area or a small group of clients, and this agent will only be able to view the sales data for this small group of clients. And that really limits the data security risk in case of human error. Something else that we do that goes on top of that is nudges. So nudges, we're talking about the default, and the default, I think, also apply not only to what the client will accept, but also to the default in our software to make sure the distributor adopt good practices. So for example, by default, we force to have like a second level of authentication on the mobile app, because we know that agents losing their mobile phone is something that can happen. and that sometimes the agent might not have a password or strong password on their mobile phone. And so having on the app itself a secondary like PIN, sort of what you have on banking apps, really increases the security and reduces the risk of data loss in case of the agent losing their phone. Another nudge that we do is really trying to get our distributor to work in a secure environment. So rather than downloading data, like downloading Excel, downloading CSV extract, we try to get the distributor by offering by default live links. So instead of downloading a CSV and processing it, we offer tutorials and links so that distributor can use the CSV or can use the data directly in Google Sheets without downloading it. Or even better, we offer BI tools and try to really push distributors to use that so that the data doesn't ever have to leave a secure environment and doesn't ever get downloaded to the computer of someone, which is where there's less control and more risk for data leaks. And I think the final thing that we do is trying to educate. So we have like every quarter with each of our customers, we try to have a discussion about how their operations are going and things like that. And we usually try to discuss issues of how they actually deal with the contract with their clients. So especially for smaller distributors that are just starting, often they're trying to figure out a lot of things on their own, for which we already have experience, having ourselves had operations in the past and working with many distributors. And we really try to give them good practices in terms of writing clear client contracts. There's a website I really like that is always an inspiration for me. It's called Terms of Service Didn't Read, that offers a summarized version of common contract, like when you sign up for Facebook or whatever, gives it to you in 5 or 6 bullet points. And it's always like some things that we try to recommend. Even if you have a relatively complex contract, try to make a summarized version in a few bullet points that your clients can understand more easily. And I think that's it. I will try to not, I realize that we're a little bit over time, so we'll try to not speak much more.
No worries. Thank you very much. Very interesting to hear. I actually did want to stay a little bit more with you because we saw there was a question from the audience that might align very well with what you said on how you try to help distribution partners and SMEs. But the question was, what should we as a startup look for with regards to data security when the company is trying to select the pay-go software service provider? So maybe from the other side, what would you recommend?
Sure. So I think, as I was saying earlier, the first thing to look at would be like the actual technical security. So making sure, and you can directly send them an email and ask them a little bit more about what security practices they have in place, like where their data is hosted, and making sure that they use like good solid like encryption and like modern version of the encryption protocols to make sure that technically the data is secure. The second thing that I would recommend is look at what their defaults are. So what their defaults for enforcing password protection, for the permission setting, and for that sort of thing are. And that usually tells you about how much of an effort you will have to do as a distributor to actually ensure the protection of your client's data.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I see we've come to the end of the hour, but please, if there are any questions that you would like to still ask, do not hesitate to put them in an email and we will try to get back to you. Yeah, with that, let me see. I think I'd like to wrap it up at this moment. So thank you very, very much to Isabel and our speakers from Sun Culture and Solaris, John, Tom, and Ben. Very happy to have you here, to have had you here today and hear all the interesting insights from you. I do encourage you all to take a look at the briefing notes. We've been working really hard to to make it an interesting and meaningful document to you. So please check it out. And as said, if there are any questions you still like to ask that we didn't have time for today, send us an email. I'll get this up. So here are the email addresses. And we will share the slides and the recording later with you, so you can check everything out. With that, I'd like to wish you a very good rest of the day and hope to engage with you in further collaboration. So thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.